rebuilding and restructuring industry, infrastructure, and investments, using, as you all have outlined in the memo, establishing a new National Development Council, a National Development Bank, spreading the Fed back to its original purpose, which a lot of people didn't realize what the original purpose of the Fed was. You taught us a lot today, Robert. And with digital taxpayer wallets, this administration could do all of that for the benefit of improving the employment situation, innovation, small business, green tech, debt and deficit reduction, export growth, and wealth and income inequality. The Biden-Harris administration could accomplish all of this without legislation and without the Senate. That's the case you're making. How so?
That's the key. Yeah. So the thing is, we would prefer, we hope that we're going to get that Senate majority, and we actually believe that we will. We're all very confident about Georgia. But it's crucial, we think, for the incoming administration not to assume that's going to happen, because just in case it doesn't, we need a plan B, so to speak. But the cool thing is that the memo lays out in those 7 pages is that we actually do have that plan B. So for example, starting with the National Development Council, you don't need any new legislation to do this. You've got all of these cabinet officials already, and you've got all these departments already. All that Mr. Biden and Ms. Harris have to do is say, let's meet, guys, monthly, and let's carve out, let's sort of work out or sort of develop this national development strategy and see where we most need to be directing public money to give a leg up or to give a boost, to give a kind of booster shot to industries that are really promising for the future, but need some startup capital to get started, right? So you could do this, you could do that right now. In theory, Mr. Trump could do this, but of course he won't. As far as the National Development Bank is concerned, we have an instrumentality already within Treasury that, again, nobody seems to know anything about any more than they know about Treasury direct accounts. It's called the Federal Financing Bank, or FFB, and it's basically a central financial administrator that basically administers or coordinates, let's use that word again, coordinates the Treasury Department's various expenditures. Because anytime we're spending federal money that's been appropriated by Congress, it's spent by the Treasury, right? And the Treasury needs a way to do that in a kind of coherent, centralized way, so it kind of knows what checks are being cut. You know, it all has to be sort of available in one place. And that's what the Federal Financing Bank is for. So we could use the FFB as the financial coordinator that corresponds to the planning coordinator that the National Development Council would be. It's already there. There's absolutely, you don't need new legislation to have it doing this kind of thing. That's what it does already. And then finally, thirdly, the spreading the Fed idea requires no new legislation, because that legislation's been on the books since 1913. It's just called the Federal Reserve Act, right? There's nothing that prevents the Fed from doing what it was originally meant to do. All of the sort of weird mission creep and changes in the mission of the Fed have been, well, I don't want to overstate it. There's been some legislation that's caused some of that change, but the overwhelmingly greater part of the Fed's falling away from its original vision is essentially just stuff that the Fed has done on its own. It's just morphed into, on its own, on the basis of its existing authority, this much more Wall Street focused central bank. But it can morph back under the same authority, because again, all of this is within the discretionary authority of the Fed under the Federal Reserve Act. So what we're arguing is all three of these things could be done with or without new legislation. It would be great to have new legislation, because then there'll be an extra bit of oomph to it. It kind of has a more sort of, it sort of signals that, hey, we're all on board with this, you know, Congress and the president. But our point is that if we don't get that, we can do it anyway, because it's all within the existing statutory authority and the constitutional authority, of course, of the president and the president's cabinet and the Fed.
Yeah, no, that's important. This has been fascinating. If I could put you on the spot.
Sure.
I would ask you all to consider, in terms of the wealth and income inequality issue, some of us have been working on a piece of legislation for years, and we're close to a markup, maybe even before the end of the year. And that's for HR 40, and that would be the commission to that would study what forms, not whether there should be reparations, but what forms reparations might take, and that would be inclusive, frankly, of some of the things that you're talking about, but specifically for wealth and income inequality, not ruling out individual payments, but some of us, I mean, you give you give every African American a couple $1,000 in this economy, Robert, in a pandemic, that's gone tomorrow. Everything else, there's no stimulus. So I mean, that's just, you're basically just financing a temporary stimulus until McConnell stops the next situation. But instead, the type of investment that you're talking about, because African Americans were not included early on in the Homestead Act and the GI Bill and those types of things that established the middle class that is now under siege. I would just ask you guys to consider also supporting that, because here's where we are. With no Senate, the Biden-Harris administration could still appoint that commission. They don't need a bill. Now, we have 200 co-sponsors in the House, but we don't have the Senate yet. We've got maybe about 20 co-sponsors in the Senate. But the Biden-Harris administration can do so. We're going to set up a national development bank in total, but we're also going to look at how do we deal with systemic racism, vis-a-vis reparations, vis-a-vis economic investment in the African-American community that has been historically discriminated against. Economics professor, is that making any sense to you?
Oh, it makes total sense. We're all on board with that, Reverend. We're probably all on board with it in our own particular ways. My own way might be on the more sort of radical end, but maybe it's not. I'll just tell you what it is, and you can tell me how it strikes you. So we owe an enormous debt to the descendants of slaves, and also people who are in effect treated as if they too were the descendants of slaves, right? You don't really have to have been an actual literal descendant if you live in a community that is systematically deprived, because it is primarily a community that was developed by the descendants of slaves. So if you think about the human capital that was simply extracted out of human beings up until the late 1860s as legally, like as part of the law, and then illegally, but still really, even after then, right? That's what Jim Crow and systematic discrimination in the workplace and in job hiring and in capital availability to start up new businesses has been. If you sort of look at all of that, you recognize that we have this sort of enormous debt, obviously. And furthermore, that the kinds of compensation that we've paid out thus far are much more in the nature that you sort of opened with, the idea of just making some payments to folk so that they can go out and buy stuff. There doesn't seem to have been a systematic attempt to basically place African-American Americans and actually all non-white Americans on the same level when it comes to the opportunity to establish or start up new businesses, to develop human potential through higher education of various kinds, when it comes to sort of access to public sector financing for startups and the like. We've done nothing along those lines, or almost, next to nothing, right? And here's the other thing that's kind of interesting, it seems to me, is that this is one of those interesting cases where doing what justice requires also happens to be the most stimulative thing that you could do for economic growth, meaning that even people who are not people of color would benefit enormously by doing this. And they would benefit more by doing this than by doing anything else that we could imagine doing. And what I mean by that is that, any economist will tell you, you probably remember this from your economic student days as well, that basically you always get a lot more stimulus bang for the buck if you're directing money toward the bottom of the income ladder or the wealth ladder, or at least not toward the top of the ladder. Because people, it's a very common sense thing if you think about it. The reason behind this, the reason that that's true, is that, let's put it this way. If you already have 10 yachts, let's say you're at the top of the ladder and you own 10 yachts, right, and somebody gives you a ton more money, what are you going to do? Are you going to buy an 11th yacht? Or are you just going to basically use that on the casino, basically put it in Wall Street? You're probably going to do the latter. And that's just to say that your marginal propensity to consume, to use J.M. Keynes's term, is very low compared to your marginal propensity to quote unquote invest, or let's just say speculate or gamble. If on the other hand, you're toward the bottom of the ladder, if you've got more money coming your way, you're actually going to spend that into the real economy. right? And that's going to generate growth and employment, and then you get a kind of virtuous circle or virtuous cycle. And so, in a sense, if we do the reparations thing as sort of part of the bigger thing, we're really going to make the bigger thing much more effective as a growth generating thing than it would otherwise be. So this is one of the, it's often, as you know, you and I have probably both torn our hair out over this. How often have we heard people say, well, there's a kind of growth versus equity trade-off or a justice efficiency trade-off? It's just not true. In 9 out of 10 cases, at least, probably more like 99 out of 100 public policy choice situations, the just thing to do is also the more efficient and growth stimulating thing to do. So we get a massive twofer out of this. You can have your cake and eat it too, as they say, because you could be a more just society, and precisely because you're a more just society, be a much more efficient and fast growing and wealthy and prosperous society. Our Scandinavian friends, the Scandinavian economies, are a great set of economies to look at in this connection. They've made a real point of being egalitarian. And what's sort of interesting is that they have consistent, steady growth in prosperity and standards of living. And so even though we tend to have these stereotypes, isn't Scandinavia where those Bergman films come out of? Doesn't that mean everybody's dour and dark and sort of pessimistic and blah, blah, blah? But, when we do these like happiness studies across the world where people report on their personal well-being and how content they are with their lives, ironically, the Danes, Denmark, always is at the top of the list, and Sweden and Norway are sort of near the top. And it's basically because they've made a real point of being egalitarian in their economic arrangements, which then makes everybody much more prosperous, and it makes growth more reliable. We could really take a page out of that playbook, it seems to me, and we would be much better off if we were to do that. And if we do it, it means we really start with those who are not at the top already. And that means starting, first of all, with those that we basically stole human capital from for hundreds of years. Maybe one last observation worth making in this connection is, we're a very present-minded culture, so we don't tend to think in terms of the distant past. But, it's still far less than half of our presence here on this continent that African Americans have been, quote unquote, free. In other words, African Americans were enslaved for much longer than they've been free, even as a legal matter, even as a de jure matter. And then if you focus instead of legal sort of freedom on practical or actual or real freedom, well, we're still not even there. We've never got there. So we've got about 500 years to sort of, close to 500 years to sort of reverse and undo, in effect, at least as far as systematic racism is concerned, and systemic or systematic disadvantaging of certain ethnic groups or people who are not basically from, descended from Western Europeans is concerned. So there's so much we can do still. And I think all of us at New Consensus are really excited about that.